Imagine standing on a white sand beach in Tahiti, waves lapping at your feet. Behind you, volcanic peaks rise into clouds, while ahead stretches the vast Pacific Ocean. Now picture ancient seafarers launching wooden canoes into this immensity, heading not toward visible land, but into empty horizon, guided only by stars, currents, and birds. For generations, we have been told that these journeys were accidents. Fishermen blown off course, survivors of shipwrecks. The narrative persisted. Primitive people could not possibly have navigated thousands of miles intentionally. But buried in the DNA of modern Polynesians lies evidence of one of the most extraordinary chapters in human exploration. A story that rewrites what we thought we knew about our past. The first time Dr. Rebecca Alton analyzed the genetic sample from Emoria, she thought there must be contamination. She ran the sequence again. The results remained unchanged. "This cannot be right," she muttered, staring at her computer screen in the dim light of her laboratory at the University of Auckland. What appeared in that DNA analysis would eventually upend centuries of academic consensus about how the Pacific Islands were settled and force historians to confront uncomfortable truths about how we evaluate indigenous knowledge. "We have been looking at Polynesian history through the wrong lens," Rebecca would later explain in her groundbreaking 2018 paper. Western academia dismissed oral traditions as myths while privileging its own creation stories as science. The DNA tells a different story. What was in that genetic code that proved so revolutionary? And why did it remain hidden for so long? The history of the Pacific as taught in schools follows a familiar narrative. Around 3,000 years ago, people from Southeast Asia began spreading eastward in simple vessels, island hopping until they reached Samoa and Tonga. Then, after a long pause, they somehow found and settled the far-flung islands of eastern Polynesia, Tahiti, Hawaii, Easter Island, and eventually New Zealand, completing the most extensive maritime migration in pre-industrial human history. But how they navigated these enormous distances across open ocean remained contentious. Many Western scholars insisted such journeys must have been accidental. Dr. Richard Zimmerman, a geneticist specializing in population migration patterns, remembers learning this version in school. The implication was clear: these were primitive people getting lucky, not skilled navigators with sophisticated knowledge systems. He shakes his head. DNA is now forcing us to re-examine those assumptions. In 2008, on a remote atoll in French Polynesia, a local elder approached a team of visiting scientists. "My grandfather always said we came from the east and west," he told them, pointing in opposite directions. The researchers nodded politely, but privately dismissed this as confused mythology. The scientific consensus was clear. Polynesian settlement moved from west to east, following prevailing winds and currents. East-to-west migration against these forces seemed implausible. Yet that chance encounter planted a seed of curiosity in one researcher's mind. When Dr. Alton began collecting DNA samples across Polynesia in 2015, she wasn't looking to overturn historical narratives. Her goal was to better understand genetic diversity across Pacific populations to improve healthcare outcomes. But science often delivers unexpected discoveries to the prepared mind. What struck me immediately was the genetic signature that appeared in our eastern samples, Rebecca explains, leaning forward in her chair during our interview. There were markers that couldn't be explained by the standard settlement model. Those markers would lead to the first of many revelations that have transformed our understanding of Polynesian history. But to appreciate the magnitude of these discoveries, we need to understand how DNA functions as a historical record, one far more reliable than written documents created centuries after the fact. Each of us carries within our cells a biological chronicle of our ancestors. DNA mutates at a relatively consistent rate over time, creating genetic markers that can be tracked across generations and populations. By analyzing these markers, scientists can determine not just ancestry, but also approximate when populations diverged or intermixed. Think of it like a family tree written in molecular ink, explains Dr. Zimmerman. We can see who's related to whom, and roughly when their ancestral lines branched off. When Rebecca's team conducted comprehensive genetic sampling across dozens of Polynesian islands and compared the results with DNA from indigenous populations throughout the Pacific Rim, they found something remarkable. evidence of multiple voyaging periods, deliberate two-way journeys, and contact with the Americas long before European arrival. The story revealed in those genetic markers contradicts nearly everything written in conventional history books. But before we explore these findings in detail, let us step back and consider why the standard narrative persisted for so long despite contradicting evidence. Western academia has a troubled history of dismissing indigenous knowledge. When Polynesian navigators like Tapaya demonstrated to Captain Cook their ability to locate islands they had never physically visited, these skills were treated as curiosities rather than evidence of sophisticated navigational systems. Similarly, when oral histories described voyages of exploration and settlement, these accounts were classified as legends rather than historical records. This dismissal reflects what anthropologists now recognize as a cultural bias in how knowledge is validated. Written sources, even those composed centuries after events by people with no direct connection to them, were privileged over oral traditions maintained by cultures specifically trained in precise memorization and transmission of knowledge. There's an irony here, notes cultural anthropologist Dr. Miranda Kikoa. Western scholars prided themselves on empiricism while ignoring the empirical evidence before them. Seafaring technologies that clearly worked, navigational knowledge demonstrably effective, and oral histories containing verifiable geographical details. The advent of DNA analysis has forced a reckoning with these biases. Genetic evidence cannot be dismissed as myth or exaggeration. It exists as measurable biological fact. And what the DNA reveals is a history far more complex and intentional than the accidental drift theory that dominated academic thinking for generations. In 2012, a study published in Current Biology found that between 12 to 15% of DNA in native Easter Islanders, Rapa Nui, appeared to be of Native American origin, dating to around 1280 to 1495 CE, centuries before European contact. This finding initially met with skepticism. How could South Americans have crossed nearly 2,500 miles of open ocean to reach Easter Island? Or conversely, how could Polynesians have voyaged to South America and returned? The answers lay in further genetic sampling across the Pacific. We found that same genetic signature on other islands, Rebecca explains, not just Easter Island but also in the Marquesas, the Tuamotus, and even as far west as Samoa. This wasn't a one-off contact event. It represented a pattern of interaction. But the revelations didn't stop there. As analytical techniques improved and sample sizes increased, researchers identified evidence of deliberately planned, two-way voyages spanning thousands of miles. The genetic markers showed not random drift but strategic exploration, with populations maintaining contact across vast distances. Perhaps most surprising was the discovery that Polynesian settlement didn't always proceed in the presumed west to east direction. Some islands show evidence of settlement from multiple directions, with later arrivals intermingling with established populations. The Pacific wasn't a one-way street, Dr. Zimmerman notes. These were maritime cultures treating the ocean not as a barrier but as a highway, with traffic moving in multiple directions. The genetic evidence also undermines the notion of isolated, accidental settlement. Far from being lost or blown off course, Pacific navigators maintained networks of contact across enormous distances, creating what some researchers now call a sea of islands, an interconnected region where knowledge, materials, and people circulated regularly. This revelation aligns perfectly with what Polynesian oral traditions have maintained all along. Stories of voyagers like Cupe, who discovered Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then returned to his homeland to guide others there, were dismissed as myth despite containing accurate navigational information. The DNA now confirms what indigenous knowledge holders have always known. These were histories, not fantasies. But while genetics has revolutionized our understanding of Polynesian settlement patterns, the most profound insights come from combining this science with indigenous knowledge systems that Western academia long ignored. Consider the mystery of how Polynesian navigators found tiny islands across thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments. For decades, Western scholars could not explain this feat without resorting to theories of accident or blind luck. But when researchers finally began listening to traditional navigators, a sophisticated system was revealed. Master navigator Nainoa Thompson explains, "Our ancestors developed a science of wayfinding that reads the stars, the sun, ocean swells, cloud patterns, bird behavior, and dozens of other natural phenomena. This isn't mysticism. It's empirical knowledge developed over centuries and tested against the harshest possible conditions. Modern experiments have validated these methods. In 1976, the Hkli, a traditional double-hulled voyaging canoe, sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional navigation, proving the viability of these techniques. Subsequent voyages have connected islands throughout the Pacific, retracing ancient routes identified in oral traditions. This convergence of genetic science and indigenous knowledge creates a more complete picture than either could provide alone. DNA can tell us when populations moved and intermixed, but cannot explain how. Traditional knowledge explains the how but often lacks precise dating. Together, they reveal a history of deliberate exploration unmatched in the pre-industrial world. As we begin to appreciate the true scope of Polynesian voyaging accomplishments, a question emerges. Why have these achievements been so consistently undervalued in world history? There's an uncomfortable truth here about how we assign historical importance, says historian Dr. Patrick Kirch. Europeans sailing from Spain to the Caribbean are celebrated as great explorers, despite having instruments, metal tools, and large ships. Polynesians navigating much greater distances with wood and stone technology are portrayed as lucky drifters. The double standard is hard to ignore. This brings us to one of the most stunning revelations from recent genetic research. Evidence of contact between Polynesia and the Americas centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The presence of sweet potatoes throughout Polynesia had long puzzled botanists. Native to South America, these tubers somehow spread across the Pacific before European contact. Some researchers suggested they might have drifted across the ocean, an explanation that now seems unnecessarily complicated given what we know about Polynesian voyaging capabilities. In 2020, a breakthrough study in Nature confirmed through DNA analysis that Native Americans and Polynesians had indeed made contact around 1200 CE. By examining the genomes of over 800 individuals from Polynesia and coastal South American populations, researchers identified a shared genetic signature that could only have come from direct contact. This isn't speculative anymore, emphasizes Rebecca. The genetic evidence is clear. Polynesians and Americans met, interacted, and exchanged not just crops but genetic heritage. The timing and location of this contact, centered in the Marquesas Islands around 1200 CE, aligns perfectly with the archaeological appearance of sweet potatoes in Polynesia. It also corresponds to the period when Polynesian voyaging was at its height, with long-distance journeys occurring regularly throughout the Pacific. What's remarkable is that this contact predates European transoceanic voyaging by nearly 300 years. While Columbus is celebrated for discovering America in 1492, Polynesians had already bridged the Pacific and made contact with South America centuries earlier. History books have focused exclusively on European exploration, notes Dr. Zimmerman. But if we define global exploration as connecting previously separated populations across major oceans, then Polynesians deserve recognition as the world's first global explorers. This reassessment forces us to confront biases in how technological achievement is judged. European navigation relied heavily on instruments, compasses, astrolabes, charts. Polynesian wayfinding used natural phenomena interpreted through sophisticated mental frameworks passed down through specialized training. Western science privileged tools you could hold in your hand, explains cultural anthropologist Dr. Elena Forster. Knowledge held in the mind was considered less reliable, less scientific. But Polynesian navigation demonstrates that cognitive technology can be just as effective as physical technology, perhaps even more so under certain conditions. The voyaging techniques developed by Polynesians represent a different path to solving the same problems European navigators faced, determining position, direction, and location without landmarks. Rather than externalizing knowledge into instruments, Polynesian navigators internalized vast datasets about stars, currents, cloud formations, bird migrations, and other natural patterns. It's not that they lacked technology, Rebecca emphasizes. Their technology was cognitive and observational. They could read the ocean and sky with a precision that still astounds modern sailors. This cognitive technology proved remarkably effective. Polynesian settlers successfully located and inhabited virtually every habitable island in the Pacific, an area covering nearly a third of the planet's surface. They established trading networks spanning thousands of miles and maintained regular contact between distant archipelagos. The genetic evidence for these achievements raises another question. If Polynesians were capable of such extraordinary feats of navigation, why did their voyaging tradition eventually decline? Contrary to popular assumptions, this decline wasn't due to technological limitations or isolation. Rather, DNA analysis combined with archaeological evidence suggests a deliberate cultural shift occurred around the 14th century. What we see in the genetic record is a period of intensive long-distance voyaging followed by a phase where populations became more settled, explains Dr. Zimmerman. This doesn't reflect inability, but rather a strategic decision to focus on developing the islands they had already settled. Climate change likely played a role in this transition. The period of greatest Polynesian expansion coincided with the medieval warm period, 900–1300 CE, when relatively stable weather patterns facilitated long-distance voyaging. The subsequent Little Ice Age brought more volatile conditions, potentially making extended voyages riskier. Their decision to reduce long-distance voyaging wasn't a failure, emphasizes Rebecca. It was an adaptive response to changing environmental conditions, exactly what you would expect from a people so attuned to natural patterns. By the time Europeans arrived in the Pacific, many Polynesian societies had been focusing on local development for generations. This created a false impression that they had always been isolated, obscuring their earlier history of extensive maritime networks. The DNA evidence is now correcting this misperception, revealing not just where Polynesians came from, but how they maintained connections across vast distances. It shows that even during periods of reduced long-distance voyaging, genetic exchange continued between island groups, indicating ongoing contact. Perhaps the most profound revelation from Polynesian DNA analysis is what it tells us about human adaptability and specialized knowledge. In less than 3,000 years, a brief moment in human evolutionary history, Polynesians developed specific genetic adaptations to their maritime lifestyle. We've identified gene variants that appear to have been selected for during Polynesian expansion, explains Dr. Zimmerman. These include adaptations related to metabolism, fat storage, and possibly even traits that aided in navigation and survival at sea. One such adaptation involves genes that regulate metabolism of omega-3 fatty acids, essential nutrients abundant in seafood. Polynesians show unique genetic markers that enhance processing of these compounds, potentially providing advantages for a diet dominated by marine resources. Another intriguing finding involves genes associated with spatial memory and orientation, cognitive functions crucial for the mental mapping required in traditional navigation. While research in this area remains preliminary, evidence suggests selection pressure may have favored individuals with enhanced capabilities in these domains. What's fascinating is how quickly these adaptations appear to have developed, notes Rebecca. It challenges our understanding of how rapidly humans can evolve in response to new environments and cultural practices. This rapid adaptation wasn't limited to genetics. The development of Polynesian wayfinding represents one of history's most remarkable examples of specialized cultural knowledge evolving to solve environmental challenges. Navigation techniques were refined over generations through a process surprisingly similar to scientific methodology. Observation, hypothesis testing, data collection, and refinement of models. Successful voyages validated navigational theories. Failed ones led to adjustments. Knowledge that worked was preserved and transmitted. Ineffective approaches were discarded. The wayfinding system that emerged was essentially an indigenous science, explains traditional navigator Kala Tanaka. It required rigorous observation, pattern recognition, and predictive modeling, all hallmarks of scientific thinking, just expressed through different cultural frameworks. This perspective challenges the artificial separation between indigenous knowledge and science that has dominated Western academic discourse. Rather than seeing these as opposing systems, we can recognize them as different manifestations of humanity's drive to understand and interact with the natural world. The revitalization of traditional voyaging in recent decades has demonstrated the precision of these knowledge systems. When the Hkli completed its worldwide voyage in 2017, circumnavigating the globe using primarily traditional navigation, it validated not just Polynesian seafaring techniques, but also the value of indigenous knowledge in addressing contemporary challenges. What we're witnessing is the recovery of knowledge that was nearly lost due to colonization, says Rebecca. The DNA evidence has provided scientific validation that encourages this cultural renaissance, creating a powerful synergy between indigenous wisdom and modern science. This convergence of genetic research and cultural revitalization points to a broader transformation in how we understand human history, one that acknowledges the sophistication of indigenous technologies and challenges Eurocentric narratives of exploration and discovery. The genetic history of Polynesia also offers insights into how human societies manage resources and adapt to environmental challenges, lessons with particular relevance in our era of climate change and ecological instability. Contrary to popular narratives about isolated islands experiencing environmental collapse, often citing Easter Island as a cautionary tale, the genetic and archaeological evidence reveals a more complex story of adaptation and resilience. What we see in the DNA is evidence of ongoing connection between islands that were previously thought isolated, explains Dr. Zimmerman. These weren't closed systems doomed to exhaust their resources, but nodes in a network that shared knowledge, materials, and adaptive strategies. Recent research shows that many Pacific islands developed sophisticated resource management systems that sustained populations for centuries despite limited land area. These systems combined practical techniques, terracing, aquaculture, agroforestry, with cultural frameworks that regulated resource use through sacred restrictions, tapu, and communal obligations. The success of these management systems is written in the genetic continuity we observe, notes Rebecca. Despite challenging environments, Polynesian populations maintain genetic health and cultural vitality through sophisticated social and ecological adaptations. This perspective challenges simplistic collapse narratives that have dominated discussions of island societies. Rather than seeing isolation and limited resources as inevitable paths to failure, the evidence suggests that connectivity and knowledge sharing created remarkable resilience. As we face global environmental challenges, these insights from Polynesian history offer valuable perspectives on sustainability. They demonstrate how societies can develop localized solutions to resource constraints while maintaining broader networks of knowledge exchange, a model increasingly relevant in our interconnected but environmentally stressed world. The DNA evidence has another important story to tell, one about the impact of European arrival on Pacific populations and their subsequent resilience. When Europeans entered the Pacific, they brought devastating diseases to which Polynesian populations had no immunity. Genetic analysis reveals the scale of this demographic catastrophe, with some islands losing 90% or more of their population within decades. We can see evidence of severe population bottlenecks in the genetic record, explains Dr. Zimmerman. These represent profound demographic collapses that threatened cultural continuity and knowledge transmission. Yet remarkably, despite these enormous challenges, Polynesian cultural identity and knowledge systems survived. The genetic record shows that while populations were decimated, complete replacement did not occur. Modern Polynesians carry the DNA of those who survived these catastrophes, testament to extraordinary resilience in the face of near-extinction events. This resilience extended beyond biological survival to cultural persistence. Despite colonial prohibition of traditional practices, voyaging knowledge was preserved through various means, encoded in chants, dances, and stories that could be publicly performed without revealing their navigational content to colonial authorities. What looked like simple entertainment to outsiders often contained sophisticated navigational information, explains cultural practitioner Moana Paua. Star positions, island locations, weather patterns, all preserved in cultural forms that colonizers didn't recognize as technical knowledge. This persistence enabled the modern revitalization of traditional voyaging, as preserved knowledge was recovered, tested, and implemented in practical sailing. When the Hkli completed its first voyage to Tahiti in 1976, it represented not just a cultural statement but empirical validation of knowledge that had been dismissed as myth. The interaction between genetic science and cultural revitalization creates a powerful synergy. DNA evidence validates aspects of oral tradition, encouraging further exploration and preservation of traditional knowledge. Simultaneously, indigenous perspectives guide researchers toward questions and interpretations they might otherwise overlook. This is what decolonizing science looks like in practice, says Rebecca. Not rejecting scientific methods, but ensuring they're informed by indigenous perspectives and directed toward questions that matter to descended communities. The Polynesian example offers a model for how indigenous knowledge and modern science can work together to create more complete understandings of human history and potential. Rather than competing explanations, they provide complementary insights that together create a richer picture than either could alone. As we integrate these perspectives, entirely new questions emerge, questions that might transform our understanding not just of Pacific history but human potential. For instance, if Polynesians could develop such sophisticated navigation systems using cognitive rather than physical technology, what other approaches to problem-solving might we have overlooked by privileging instrument-based solutions? How might indigenous knowledge systems inform responses to contemporary challenges like climate change, which require both technical solutions and shifts in how humans relate to natural systems? The genetic history of Polynesia also raises profound questions about human migration and adaptation. If Pacific populations could successfully adapt to new environments with such remarkable speed, both culturally and genetically, what might this tell us about human potential for adaptation to future environmental changes? These questions point toward a transformation in how we understand human capability and history, one that recognizes multiple valid paths to knowledge and achievement. What the Polynesian example shows us, reflects Dr. Zimmerman, is that there are many ways to be sophisticated, many paths to developing effective technology. Western civilization took one approach, focusing on physical tools and written records. Polynesians developed a different but equally effective approach centered on observational acuity and cognitive mapping. This recognition challenges hierarchical views of technological development that place Western innovations at the pinnacle of human achievement. Instead, it suggests a more nuanced understanding where different cultures developed specialized expertise adapted to their particular environments and needs. For Polynesians, the vast Pacific demanded navigational precision, sustainable resource management, and technologies suited to island environments. The solutions they developed, double-hulled voyaging canoes, star-based navigation systems, integrated agroforestry, were perfectly adapted to these challenges, representing not primitive attempts at Western-style technology, but sophisticated alternatives. As we face global challenges that industrial technology alone cannot solve, these alternative approaches to knowledge and problem-solving gain new relevance. The Polynesian example demonstrates how humans can develop sustainable relationships with challenging environments through careful observation, intergenerational knowledge transmission, and technologies that work with rather than against natural systems. This perspective shift has implications far beyond historical reassessment. It suggests that addressing contemporary challenges may require not just new technologies but new ways of knowing, approaches that integrate scientific precision with indigenous understanding of interconnected natural systems. The DNA evidence from Polynesia ultimately tells a story not just about the past but about human potential, our capacity for exploration, adaptation, and creating knowledge systems attuned to specific environmental challenges. It reveals ancestors who were not passive victims of geography, but active explorers who mapped a third of Earth's surface using stars and swells as their guides. It shows societies that developed sophisticated resource management systems, allowing them to thrive on islands with limited resources for generations. And it demonstrates cultural resilience that preserved crucial knowledge through colonial suppression, enabling its revitalization in the present. Perhaps most importantly, this evidence challenges us to reconsider what counts as valuable knowledge and significant achievement in human history. It asks us to recognize the brilliance in systems we have too often dismissed as primitive or pre-scientific, and to appreciate different paths to solving the universal challenges all humans face. As we continue to uncover the genetic history of Polynesia, each new discovery reinforces a profound truth. There are many ways to be sophisticated, many forms of knowledge that deserve our respect and attention. By integrating these diverse approaches, the precision of genetic science with the holistic wisdom of indigenous knowledge, we gain a more complete understanding not just of our past, but but of our potential future. The true legacy of Polynesian voyagers may not lie in their settlement of distant islands. Remarkable as that achievement was, their greater contribution may be demonstrating an alternative relationship between humans and the natural world, one based on observation, adaptation, and sustainability rather than dominance and extraction. As we face unprecedented environmental challenges, this legacy offers not just historical insight but practical wisdom. The same observational acuity that allowed Polynesians to navigate by stars might inform how we monitor and respond to changing climate patterns. The resource management systems that sustained island populations could inspire approaches to local sustainability within global networks. In this way, the genetic history of Polynesia speaks not just to what history books have missed, but to what our future might become, if we have the wisdom to learn from ancestors whose achievements we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The DNA of Polynesian peoples, long overlooked in world history, contains the signature of humanity's most extraordinary explorers, navigators who connected vast oceanic distances not by accident, but through observation, knowledge, and courage that remains unsurpassed in human exploration.